Hi, everybody. This is Keir Murray in Houston, Texas. I'm joined by Dr. Richard Murray from the University of Houston, also my dad. Today is Monday, April 6th, 2020. It is 2:30 or so in the afternoon. This is our third installment of the Murray Men on Politics, where we are taking advantage of our sequestered lifestyle in these days to once a week do some commenting on how this crisis, both health and economic, is playing out in terms of its effects on our political system. As everyone knows, we have a presidential election this fall, a very consequential one, and certainly the healthcare and economic fallout from this crisis is likely to play a large role in that. For those of you that joined us this morning, we had some technical difficulties with the podcast. So just in the interest of clarity and getting something that everyone can easily digest, Dad and I just decided to go ahead and re-record just the two of us this afternoon. So we'll resume the regular format with people participating live next week, assuming we have a podcast next week. So here we are on April 6th, about a month into this crisis in the United States in real terms. We've got about 350,000 identified cases in the U.S. and sadly, about 10,000 deaths so far. Where's your sense, Dad, of where we are at the moment in this?
Well, I think we have some pretty good modeling from the virologists and epidemiologists that, we're still on the up slope. Things are clearly going to get worse in most areas. Maybe in Seattle, they're at the peak. But the projection models that had a range at the end of the crisis of 100,000 deaths, possibly as many as 220 or more, 220,000 or more, those look pretty accurate. So we're going to have a lot more illness, a lot more mortality. Hopefully we can avoid the healthcare system in these hot spots collapsing. Right now, New Orleans looks like it's probably in the most severe mode, followed by New York. So, we've known for 2 or 3 weeks this is a likely track of this disease. Unfortunately, it's hewing pretty closely to the models.
Yeah, and I think it's important for folks to remember that, at least based on what I've read from some of the medical and public health experts, this is not likely to be a one and done kind of problem. And we're seeing this play out in Asia. Some of the places where they thought they'd gotten this COVID outbreak stopped, it's now restarted. And so I think Americans, along with everyone else worldwide, probably have to be prepared to deal with this in waves, potentially, until there's a vaccine that's developed and can be mass produced and distributed throughout the society. I think you've talked before about the 1918 influenza pandemic in the United States. My recollection is there were 2 or 3 waves of that in the US, right?
That's correct.
And
yeah, they had an early wave in the spring, not the way things later turned out, not that severe. Came back in September, October, disaster. That's when most people got sick and died. But then after the winter in the spring of 1919, the virus returned. So we had 3 waves. Worldwide, we think about 50 million people died. That's just a guess. There's no way. We think, again, 675,000 deaths in the United States, which had about a third the population as we have today. Even now, we really, even in the US, can't trust the numbers. Clearly, we had a lot of underreporting of deaths because people were tested that we thought died of the flu or pneumonia back in late February and March, and there were large numbers of deaths, suspiciously large. A lot of those were probably coronavirus. We probably had some over-reporting in some of the systems where some deaths were attributed to the virus. But getting accurate information is really tough in a pandemic. And maybe 1 or 2 years later, you might sort of figure out this is probably the real toll. But it's bad. It's getting worse. And we're still way behind the curve on getting where we should be on testing, because without good testing data, we really don't have much confidence of where we're headed.
Right. I mean, my recollection is we're only at about 1.5 million tests completed in the United States, which again is less than, about a third of 1% of the country's population. It's a minuscule total. And so here in the state of Texas, I think the governor announced this afternoon that we've only tested about 85,000 people in a state of 29 million. And that he estimates we'll get to 100,000 tests by the end of this week. Well, that's just a very low total of people being tested on a daily basis, and just a drop in the bucket in terms of our state's population. And agreed. I mean, I think in Texas now, the virus is in about half the counties identifiably, if not more. Certainly in all the counties where the great majority of the state's population resides. And I think that trend is true nationwide. And so this notion of community spread seems like it's largely already occurred in the US. And now it's a matter of just trying to limit the exposures of folks, hence all these stay-at-home orders that have been delivered mostly by governors and sort of tepidly by the White House, right?
Yes. There are obviously sometimes some upsides to a federal system. You can experiment with things like assisted suicide for persons at the end of their life, and Oregon led the way on that. But when you have a national pandemic, you need a strong national response. And that's been one of the problems why things have spiraled so quickly out of control in the United States, is this disjointed, almost chaotic response, absent strong, clear leadership from Washington.
Right. And I want to talk about that a little more in depth in a minute. But before we sort of leave the assessing where we are at the moment, I think we've also got to talk about the economic picture, which is grim. We've seen over the last 2 weeks about 10 million new unemployment claims filed in the U.S., just a staggering number. The March jobs report came out last Friday, showed about 665,000 jobs lost in the month of March. Most of that data accumulated from before this crisis really got going. The stock market's been generally down, but bouncing around chaotically, as you've mentioned. Lots of wealth loss there. Lots of Americans in economic freefall. What's your take of where we are there, and what the near and longer term prospects are to emerge from that?
Well, clearly we've cut the elevator cables and we're still plunging. So if we have 10 million people recorded as seeking unemployment, we probably had 15 to 20 million that were trying, but the state systems were simply terribly overloaded. So in a matter of weeks, we're already getting way beyond the depth of the depression in 2008 and 9, when we were losing 700,000 or 800,000 jobs a month. We're probably now losing in a week 3, 4, 5, 6 million. That's a staggering number. And we've never seen that. Even in the Great Depression, that came on much more gradually. Now with this economy facing these dual shocks, a terrible healthcare crisis, it's caused major modifications in behavior and spending patterns that are devastating the economies. We're just in really uncharted, but very, very rough water economically.
Yeah, and what's tough to think about down the road is an economy like ours, I believe, is driven, principally 60-70% by consumer spending. And if A, folks aren't moving out and about, going to restaurants, going to stores, and B, many have lost their jobs or working fewer hours, earning less money, it really sort of torpedoes the basic model for our economy thriving. Not to mention disruptions in markets around the world from which we both buy and sell to. So, it also underscores the kind of interconnectedness we have economically, and it's very worrying for the next 6 to 12 months, and perhaps beyond that. And as we've discussed before, it's potentially will kind of cause a rethinking of some of our basic approaches to, especially the social safety net, as we discussed last time.
Yeah, just to take one particular area of the economy that's small but very visible, and that's the music industry. The old record sales driven business has pretty much collapsed. People download songs, so the artists and the professionals in that business survive by doing tours and selling tickets to events of 30, 40, 50,000 people. Well, that's not going to happen, I think, in the year 2020. So here you've got a highly visible, talented segment of the economy that's just basically been devastated with really poor prospects for coming back, given that people don't buy records much anymore.
Right. Right, and obviously with sporting events, the same thing. No games for folks to attend in the venues or watch on television, which I think is, makes things rougher for folks psychologically, in addition to everything else. So let's talk about the sort of the president in the context of everything that's going on. There's never a dull moment with Mr. Trump. He seems to bounce around in terms of his analysis of what's happening, at least how he communicates that to the American public. We're seeing now in these daily press conferences, which are now going on for 2 hours or more at a time, where he uh, talks some about the crisis itself, has some of the medical and other experts weigh in, but then also spends a lot of time airing grievances with the press and Democrats he doesn't like, that sort of thing. What's your take on how Trump is sort of positioning himself as a national leader so far, a few weeks in?
Well, I'm more focused in my political life on elections and campaigns. And the president's running a very short-term oriented campaign, 24-hour media cycles, et cetera, when the election is 7 months away. The historic record says when a president's in office and the economy really goes into a plunge, it's usually fatal for their political prospects. And I don't see that the way this president is responding is likely to change that pattern. It's just too erratic, too wandering off message, not laying out a clear rationale for why I'm the guy that can really deal with this crisis by providing steady, reassuring leadership that emphasizes I'm relying on the science and the best information we have. And that's just not what we're seeing.
Yeah, and of course, we have a federal system by nature, which means individual states have a lot of power to do things their own way. But in the context of a huge national crisis like this, virus that respects no boundaries, geographic or other, sort of normally I think most Americans would behoove their national leadership to take control and calm things down and develop a plan and proceed accordingly. We haven't really seen that happen. And so not only have we seen a pretty, I would say, disparate response among various states, depending on their leadership and how proactive they've been regarding this crisis, but we've seen a situation now where some states look like they're competing with one another for resources, for equipment from the federal government, which is a very worrying sign. Again, I think we have some hot spots that have in New York and other places that are pretty bad right now, but a lot of people think this is going to get a lot more widespread in a very urgent way in the coming couple of weeks. And it's not confidence inspiring for states all over the U.S. getting what they need to do the best they can to manage this.
So I think in any political system, when you have a sudden crisis, most citizens want the government to work together, to work effectively. They're not really interested in rehashing a lot of the old partisan arguments that suddenly are not relevant to the crisis that you're facing, particularly on the federalism front. One of the models of federalism is cooperative federalism, where the federal government often provides a lot of money, some guidance, some coordination, but then works with the states to carry out the policy effectively. That's desperately what we need now. We need a vital federal role. Nobody else has the money, the resources. The states are going to be broke in a matter of weeks. So there's a huge Washington role required. And because it's putting up money, it can have a national strategy, because the states have to have the federal financial support, but they have to be working in harmony to maximize our resources. You can't, isolate your state within the United States. We can't shut down travel between states. That would totally destroy our economy. So we've got a long way to go in terms of making this federal system work better. But the only place that can happen is in the center of the system in Washington, D.C., because you only have one president. You do have 50 different states.
Right. And I think, certainly even beyond the economic ramifications, the resource ramifications you describe, just on the short-term basic front, providing a unified message of what everyone should be doing or not doing in terms of public gatherings, that kind of things. doesn't seem to me that something that's been particularly consistent coming from the White House, and thus you've had sort of variety of degrees of response from different states around the country. We saw pastors just in some places continuing to hold church services, which most public health professionals say is really bad idea under these circumstances. I think partially because there hasn't been a unified message coming from all levels of government, but driven by the president and the federal government about how we ought to be responding to this.
Yeah, Theodore Roosevelt, I think, said, the president has the bully pulpit. He's got the megaphone, and he can speak to the whole nation effectively. Some presidents are good at that. Theodore Roosevelt, his distant cousin Franklin Roosevelt, of course, in the great crisis of the Depression and World War II. Trump has a lot of skills. He wouldn't be elected president without having a lot. But as a messenger in a crisis, he, I think, falls well short. I think scholars like John Meacham that study presidents have made that point. This is not in Donald Trump's wheelhouse. His messages are too disjunctive. He can't stay on theme. He airs grievances and so forth that the public really doesn't want to hear about. And it has elevated up the couple of doctors that are on stage, particularly Dr. Fauci, as sort of to the extent there are any heroes in this messaging world, it's the professionals, not the political leadership.
Yeah, and again, one aspect of this that's just been bizarre to me is his president's seeming fixation on this chloroquine drug that's, I think, been approved for years for treatment of things like lupus, but that some believe may have therapeutic effects in battling COVID-19, although that's not been scientifically shown in any kind of peer-reviewed study. And seems to be at odds with some of his health professionals and others, but continues to fixate on this as a potential solution. What do you think that's all about?
Well, Trump has famously said he goes with his gut. He's a hunch player. Sometimes it seems to work well. He had a hunch that he could be a very viable candidate in 2015 when many people thought he was going to be a joke, and he sure proves those folks wrong. But science, is open to hunches. You can frame a hypothesis to test something, but you can't, in science, go forward based on your gut feeling. You have to have real world data, and we've lagged badly in that regard. And the president, of course, at times has recognized, yes, there's terrible things coming, but then he veers back off message and back to hunches, like maybe this drug that's been out there for 50 years will get us out of this. And that seems highly unlikely based on the professional knowledge we have.
Yeah, and it potentially has some adverse health consequences in and of itself for some people who take it. Let's talk a little bit about voting, and we touched upon this last time about how this might affect the mechanism of voting for the election. We saw, of course, many states postpone their primaries after this crisis really got going. So we haven't had any voting in a few weeks. We were supposed to have a primary election in Wisconsin tomorrow, which was one state that had decided to go forward. I think a substantial number of mail ballots had already been cast, over 1 million, if I'm not mistaken, but they were still planning to go forward with in-person voting tomorrow. Just in the last few hours, the governor of Wisconsin, Tony Evers, has decided to postpone the in-person voting of the primary until early June, given the obvious public health concerns. But, how do we see this potentially extended health crisis playing out as we lead up into voting or not voting, and how that might affect the mechanism? I know we visited this last time, but I think it's worth revisiting because it's going to be really an important issue going forward.
We have these two very different elections. One, we were about halfway through, that is the primaries that select delegates that pick the nominees of the party. About 40% of the Democratic delegates haven't been picked yet. And so Joe Biden apparently has a probably insurmountable lead, but a lot of states like Wisconsin and New York and Pennsylvania haven't voted yet. So we still have to get that done. That's left up to the states substantially. Sometimes the feds intervene, but that's always been a very decentralized process, very state-centered, and it's going to go on through the middle of June. So we've still got 3 months to go there. But then we have to have mandated by the Constitution and enshrined in laws passed by Congress, we have to have an election that where ordinary Americans around the country finish voting on the 3rd of November. And that's to elect all the members of the House, a third of the Senate, and of course to determine whether we continue with President Trump or somebody else. And that can't be put off. I mean, except under some kind of, I think, really extraordinary circumstances, not a healthcare crisis. We've gone forward with those elections in the middle of the Civil War when tens of thousands of people were being killed. In 1918, we went forward with the November election in the height of that terrible pandemic. So that election can't really be postponed. But the question is, how in the hell are we going to run it? And that's largely left up to the 50 states. And they have hugely varying existing laws and rules. And some states especially make it easier and easier to vote. And a lot of those, like Oregon and Colorado, rely now heavily on voting by mail. Other states don't make it easy to vote. Particularly Republican states don't seem to be especially interested in encouraging much larger turnout. That's been a bit of a problem in the past. I think it could be an enormous problem this year because my guess, not health expert, is that the lingering effects of the virus are still going to be pretty significant in October and November this year, when we normally would be starting voting, particularly in Texas, for example. We have a big open in-person early vote window. That's when most of us cast our votes. But that means, if we do the traditional way, long lines outside Fiesta and lots of other places, that may not be possible. So there's going to be a lot of pressure everywhere to move more toward vote by mail. And in the Democratic states, they seem to be pretty comfortable with that. But in states like Texas and Florida, where you have conservative Republican governors, they are probably going to resist. So it could be a mess. And it's a mess, I fear, that would end up going to the Supreme Court, where somebody would question, given that you've got all these different systems of voting, that maybe this isn't really a legitimate election. And we have to have the 9 Supremes weighed in, as they did in December 2000, to settle the Bush v. Gore race.
Yeah, and one way I'm thinking about this is that the primary election, as you described, is occurring in the middle of the heat of this pandemic, and I think states around the country, even Republican-controlled states, are going to have to make accommodations for voters to allow virtually anyone who wants to vote by mail. And there's been some, for example, in Texas, I think the Secretary of State has responded that that's her plan, is to anyone who wants a mail ballot for the primary runoffs in either party can get one. It seems to me the problem for them with doing that is they've then set a precedent that that would create an expectation that people could do that for November, when they may be much less inclined to want to do that. I mean, it's one thing when the two parties are voting separately and, Republican Party doesn't much care what happens in the Democratic primary and vice versa. But when you get to a general election, even in a state like Texas, which has been historically Republican for the last 25 years or so, but has been pretty rapidly moving into a more competitive state, if you facilitate voting by mail, making it easier for folks to be able to request and get a ballot and cast it that way, there might be some political risk involved for the powers that be in this state. I mean, how do you see that potentially playing out? Just as a matter of precedent, if you let people do it once, you've opened the door. Hard to deny them if they want to do it again in November if they raise legitimate health concerns about going to a polling place.
Of course, we already make it easy if you're 65 or older to request and get a no excuse ballot to vote by mail. And once you do that, you automatically get an application sent to you for the next election. But under 65, we're pretty restrictive. And so that's the zone where we're going to fight this out. I think some kind of accommodation, even in Texas, has to be made in the general election. But I think Republicans will try to make that as narrow as possible. And Democrats will try to make it as broad as possible. The problem for the Democrats is, they are the minority party. Even if there's a special session of the legislature before November, the Republicans control both the state house, the Senate, and of course the governor can veto whatever comes out. So, I think it's going to be itself a major political issue in the fall. Are you trying to block voting, or are you trying to protect the integrity of the election process, which is the Republican argument for not allowing unlimited voting by mail?
Right, and we've seen Trump, of course, weigh in on this issue a couple of times in the last week. First, saying that if you let everybody vote by mail, you'd never have another Republican elected again. And then I think at a press conference over the weekend saying that, people cheat and voting by mail, he's not interested in seeing that go forward. And then I think I even saw the Speaker of the Georgia State House make an argument that it would be a disaster for them if every voter in the state got a mail ballot sent to them, i.e. they'd lose. So yeah, I think very interesting to watch and see how, and very important to see how that develops.
Well, we were on track from the voting we saw in the midterm, the special elections for governor in Virginia and New Jersey, Kentucky, and early primary participation to have a continuation of a huge surge in voter turnout. Now, of course, this crisis has thrown a huge monkey wrench into the whole machinery of government, including voting. So maybe we won't have a huge turnout in November, because if people are frightened and worried about their health and want to maintain social distance, one way to do that is stay home. So it could have a profound effect just because of the psychology being different, as well as the mechanics. And elections, of course, are partly about what vote share you get from particular populations, but they're also about turnout. And if we were on track before this crisis to have what I think an absolute modern record turnout in November 2020, and now that's in considerable doubt.
Yeah, yeah. So we've talked a lot about the lacking response here in the United States, and not just in the US, other countries. The UK has had a rough response to this COVID crisis. It's sad to see this afternoon that their Prime Minister Boris Johnson is now in intensive care in London with the virus himself. Lots of examples of countries that haven't handled this particularly well. What's a country that you've seen that's done a pretty good job in managing this so far?
I give the highest marks to Germany, both in terms of the healthcare side. They have, of course, a very modern and well-funded healthcare system with broad insurance available, but also in cushioning the economic shock. The Europeans have much better safety nets, so that when you have massive layoffs, most people in Germany are still going to get checks, not the full amount, but most people in the United States not. Now, we've had a short-term life raft thrown out, but it's not big enough, nearly big enough. And we have, we're going to have to keep coming back and doing more and more legislation. We can't have 25 or 30 million people out of work in this country, not able to pay their bills, pay their rent, the devastating psychological effects. So the European countries, they have some weaknesses. Our banking system is probably stronger than theirs, but they have a lot stronger system of a social safety net that will protect from sliding into some kind of absolute economic disaster that, among other things, might lead to a surge in political violence as extremists take advantage of public fears and anxieties, and bad things could start happening.
Well, yeah, particularly in a country like ours where we have a heavily armed citizenry, right? Much more so than in places like Europe. Okay, well,
regard, after the 1918 pandemic, we went into about a 2-year period of the greatest amount of political violence in the history of the United States outside of the Civil War. There were riots. There were, on the left, radicals setting off bombs on Wall Street. You had several thousand people in Tulsa, Oklahoma, destroy a prosperous Black community called Greenwood, where hundreds of people were murdered. The crisis in the country of the double shock of the terrible war and then the pandemic, sure, I think contributed some to this huge surge of violence in the United States.
Yeah, well, we certainly don't want to see that again. I think on that note, we'll probably wrap it up for today. Again, for those of you who joined us this morning, apologies for the kind of bumpy ride we had there. We decided to go ahead and re-record this afternoon, and we'll try to get back on track with everybody's live participation as next week if we can. Anything in closing, Dad, before we go?
Well, I don't want to totally paint a dark picture. The United States is a very strong country in many ways. Americans are very resilient. We're seeing people, for example, in the healthcare professions fly to New York to try to help people deal with this crisis. Neighbors are helping neighbors. We're going to need a lot of that. And so we can do some things individually, some things network-wise, but the political system has to deliver. The number one responsibility of government is to protect the citizens of the country. And sometimes the governments fail. Let's hope that's not the case this time around.
Yeah, and just on a personal note for me, my one hope I have that whenever the dust settles on this experience is that Americans collectively will be willing to have a national conversation about preparedness. We were clearly caught not ready for this. Not that anyone could ever be fully ready for something like this, but there were, seems to me, clearly things that we could have and should have done. There'll be time to sort all that out later, but I very much hope that our country's willing to have that kind of rational conversation about preparedness, how we protect ourselves from, having a much worse outcome with this situation, I fear, than was necessary.
And economically, if we're going to declare 50, 60, 70 million working class people as essential workers who have to keep driving the trucks and filling the grocery stores, maybe we'll consider paying them a little better in a very wealthy country where we've steadily squeezed down wages for most working people. And that's been going on for 40 years. I think it's pretty much going to end in 2020 and 21. And we have to see some kind of serious debate about helping the people that the economy has left behind.
Which is a growing number. And again, as we pointed out before, I think, is part of the reason that so many Americans are at such economic risk right away with this crisis, because they have little to no savings to weather a rainy day and potentially a long one here with this crisis. And, maybe some of that can be attributed to personal behavior, but some of it's the fact that a lot of people struggle just to barely pay their bills in this country. And that seems to me not a sustainable situation long term.
Well, the Depression changed Americans' attitudes about the role of government. People saw, even if they had worked hard and played by the rules, their livelihood totally disappeared, and they couldn't restore it by individual action. Now we're in a situation where we have to depend upon big government, and we have to depend upon experts within big government. And if we're going to get out of this, we got a lot riding on Steve Mnuchin, the Secretary of the Treasury, who looks like he's the adult in the room at trying to manage this terrifically difficult and complex program of making sure this lifesaver raft that's been thrown out there gets to where it's supposed to go, and also negotiating the next bill that's surely going to have to be done.
Yeah, first of many is my guess. Okay, well, thanks everybody for joining us. Hope everyone has a safe and healthy week and looking for better days ahead. And Dad will plan to pick this back up next week.
Sounds good.
Okay, bye-bye.